Good morning and welcome to today's press conference. Bienvenue à cette conférence de presse. My name is Mia Rabson. I'm a reporter with the Canadian Press and I will be moderating today's event. We have with us on the stage today MP Ali Assassi and I believe four other speakers for this event. So we will start with the MP, but I just, before we begin, need to read a few preventative measures to prevent disruptive and potentially harmful audio feedback incidents that can cause injuries. We remind all in-person participants to keep their earpieces away from all microphones at all times. When you're not using your earpiece, please place it face down on the middle of the sticker for this purpose that you will find on the table. Please consult the cards on the table for guidelines to prevent audio feedback incidents. These measures are in place so that we can protect the health and safety of all participants, including the interpreters, and conduct our business without interruption. Thank you all for your cooperation, and now we can proceed. Thank you.
Thank you. Today I'm honored to welcome to Ottawa some very distinguished experts. We're here because each of these individuals have in-depth knowledge and expertise on atrocities that occurred in Ethiopia between 2020 and 2022. And it's a great honor to have with me here Dr. Azim Ibrahim from the New Lines Institute, Kyle Matthews from the Montreal Institute for Genocide and Human Rights Studies, Professor John Packer, who is familiar to you all from the University of Ottawa, and Makeda Lul, from the Security and Justice for Tigrayans Canada. Today, we're here because the New Lines Institute has just released a report. As you know, the conflict in Ethiopia was one of the bloodiest of the 21st century, during which over 700,000 individuals perished. The report that is released today delves into significant human rights abuses and war crimes that were committed during that period. However, unfortunately, despite the horrific toll and the scale of the violence unleashed in Ethiopia, the conflict remained underreported and has generally evaded public attention. I certainly hope this new report will ensure that parliamentarians, government officials, academics, and experts pay attention to our responsibilities and focus on what needs to be done going forward. The report identifies concrete steps that the international community should consider to promote a just and stable peace in Ethiopia. So that having been said, it is my great pleasure to welcome back to Ottawa Dr. Azim Ibrahim, who can provide us more information on the report.
Thank you so much, Mr. Assassi, for that introduction. It's wonderful to be back here in Ottawa. Ladies and gentlemen, the Tigray war in Ethiopia currently stands as the deadliest armed conflict of the 21st century and the bloodiest since the end of the Cold War. Some credible estimates state that over 1 million people have died, both civilian and soldiers. But despite this staggering loss of life, and despite the magnitude of this tragedy, the world has largely turned a blind eye to this forgotten war. Initial international efforts have faded away. The International Commission of Human Rights Experts on Ethiopia has ceased operations without completing its work. The US has returned to providing financial and economic assistance to Ethiopia as if nothing had ever happened. And even the European Union has resumed its $680 million of development strategy with Ethiopia. This neglect by the international community is extremely serious. It is a serious breach of international law that have not been thoroughly investigated and adequately addressed. And it's for this reason that the New Lines Institute commissioned this groundbreaking report to shed light on the sheer scale and variety of the criminal conduct in Tigray. And the result is that we have produced the most comprehensive report on this subject that examines the evidence and provides the most extensive and detailed legal analysis. We approach this report through the lens of the Genocide Convention, but we also outline paths to accountability at national and international levels. The report took over 2 years to do and involved hundreds of thousands of words. And this is not something new. The New Lines Institute did extensive reports on genocide, on the Uyghur issue, on the Rohingya, and in Ukraine. And this was the logical next project to ensure that the Genocide Convention is upheld. All sides, to be clear, committed war crimes, but in particular the report finds that the Ethiopian National Defence Force, the Eritrean Defence Force, and the Amhara Special Forces committed crimes against humanity and genocidal acts against the Tigrayan people. Genocidal acts were part of a deliberate plan and supported at the most senior level. To give you an example, one of the Prime Minister's Social Affairs advisors said on record, the Tigrayans, they should be erased and disappeared from historical records. A person who wants to study them should find nothing about them. Maybe he can find out about them by digging in the ground. That's a quote from the Prime Minister's Special Advisor. The report also finds that Ethiopia, as a state party, breached the Genocide Convention and was obligated to prevent and punish genocide. In light of this report, we can no longer allow this tragedy to remain in the shadows. It is now time to take a stand. It is time to recognise the atrocities that have been committed, and it is time that decisive action to ensure justice for the victims of genocide in Tigray is delivered soon. And with that, I'll pass it back to the chair.
Absolutely. I understand Professor Parker will be next. Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Mr. Assassi. It's a pleasure to be back here within the parliamentary frame and to be able to address this topic. And let me also commend you for your constant support of these issues over many years. I know both in your formal capacities, but also yourself as a lawyer and as a person committed to justice in the world and for our own country. As Dr. Ibrahim has mentioned, I have also had the pleasure of participating and assisting in some analyses of other situations, unfortunately in the last number of years, which have brought into the discussion the Genocide Convention and breaches of it, notably the Rohingya, Uyghurs, and Ukraine. But there are other situations, and some might ask, why continue to refer to these situations? And I remember speaking with a former minister of this government here in Canada about one of those situations, and he said, well, if we recognize that one, we're going to have to recognize some others. And to which I would reply, yes, we would. Unfortunately, this is the state of the world, and there are at least a couple of reasons why it matters that we draw attention to this now. The first is that we've heard a lot in the past, including by our own government, about the importance of a rules-based international order, about international law, of living in a dangerous world where there are increasing insecurities and uncertainties, and therefore the importance of underlining and upholding that rules-based international order, international law. Here, we are talking about yet another situation where there's no doubt about what is the applicable law. The Genocide Convention, to which there are 153 states parties, including Canada. In this case, Ethiopia was one of the first parties, signed it on the second day after its adoption, 11th of December, 1948, and ratified it very quickly, 3 years before Canada ratified it. So there's no doubt that this is the applicable standard. And the Genocide Convention, I'll just remind those listening that it's actually a pretty simple, I invite you to read it. It's only 9 substantive provisions. It's pretty straightforward. And it's foundational. Some people consider it one of the core instruments of the post-Second World War international order. So the question, therefore, is if we're going to give up and ignore this kind of foundational norm, what does it really portend for that rules-based order? And I think it's not coincidental that we're seeing a kind of increase of genocidal type activities, because we could add, sitting here, also the situation in Darfur. Of course, it's been raised in the context of Israel-Palestine, and there are actually, unfortunately, other situations in the world that we could and probably should be talking about. But I just want to underline that here we're talking about something pretty straightforward, pretty clear. we're also talking about a situation which are elaborated in the report of really a catalog of acts, violations. Some people say that we really can't talk about genocide unless there are killings. Well, there's abundant killings in this case. They say we can't talk about genocide unless there are acts against the integrity of individual persons, torture, and so on. There are abundant cases, and so forth and so on. Some really of a horrendous character. It's all horrendous, but if we were to say certain manifestations such as sexual violence and so forth, again, abundant cases. So here we have clear law, clear situation, and at scale. And this simply behooves us to stand up and to identify it. And it is really shameful in the international community that there has been effort to suppress this, and worse than that, to kind of paper over it. Such as the re-engagement by other states, because the character of genocide here is not just something that we're not supposed to do, but we are supposed to actively cooperate in the prevention of it. And one of the hallmarks of the Genocide Convention is Article 1, which is a duty to prevent genocide. And that duty is not only applicable on all 153 states parties, inter pares, between each other, but we know, according to the International Court of Justice, that that duty to prevent begins at the moment a state, and now I'm quoting or paraphrasing, the moment that a state knows or ought reasonably to know that there is a serious risk of genocide. We are way past the point of serious risk here. We know what has actually happened. So at a minimum, we can say quite definitively, Article 1 has been triggered. That duty now exists for all states parties, including Canada. Now, what does that duty entail? And the International Court of Justice has also helped us understand that. And the International Court of Justice has said that that duty entails for states to act proactively, to take steps basically within their capacity and within their proximity. And therefore we have to ask Canada in our relations with other states. We should definitely not be complicit in the performance or the continuation of acts of genocide, but we should also be doing those things which we can to exercise influence to not only stop, but to hold to account and to ensure reparation and so forth. There's a series of undertakings that follow, which are material to continuing international relations in this case. The last thing that I'd like to just mention is that the report identifies very concretely 6 recommendations, which are primarily which are divided in the domain between state responsibility, action states should take, which are within our province to take. We don't have to ask anyone about that. We don't have to go anywhere to obtain permission. But it also identifies steps that can and should be taken with regard to individuals who are identifiable, who carry particular individual responsibility, and they exist. And that includes using our own universal jurisdiction if it's appropriate, if there are persons within the jurisdiction, or acting in concert with other states for international recourses, investigations at a minimum, and so forth. I think this is fairly clear, and we hope that the government of Canada would support this. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Park. Let's turn to another very familiar friend, Kyle Matthews from the Montreal Institute for Genocide and Human Rights Studies.
Thank you, Mr. Asasi. It's great to be here. I commend the New Lines Institute for putting together this report. It's been years that we've seen atrocity crimes take place in Ethiopia, in the Tigray region. We've seen denial by the government, by other actors. The African Union is seated in Addis Ababa, has a mandate to interfere and get involved when there are mass atrocity crimes taking place, including genocide, and we've seen almost no action by the African Union. I think we are at a point where the international liberal order is tearing apart at the seams, and the number of atrocity crimes taking place across the world is a signal of that weakness. And the case of Ethiopia is a very, very serious situation that needs more attention. Canada played a very important role in the 1990s in creating, making foreign policy centered on human security, a key part of our legacy under Foreign Minister Axworthy and others. We helped create the International Criminal Court. We've also pushed for the norm and the responsibility to protect, that we must take action to prevent through all means, be it economic, diplomatic, or in any other settings of using military force, including peacekeeping, to protect civilians. Unfortunately, in the last couple of years, especially with R2P, that's fallen by the wayside. Nobody's talking about it. And so we have to engage. We have to find other actors that can help protect the people in Ethiopia, Tigrayans, who are still at risk, This report comes out, says there is genocide occurring, doesn't say that it's over. And I think that's the key point that I would like everyone to hear, is that this report says there's genocide, but it doesn't mean that people aren't suffering today. It's continuing. So we need to double our efforts and work with partners to try to protect civilians and ensure human security of Tigrayans are looked after. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kyle. Next, we will go to International Counsel Anika Weiss, who, as everyone knows, played a substantial role in producing this report. Did you have any comments?
So far,
No.
but I'm happy to take any questions that there may be. Thank you.
Sounds great. And last but certainly not least, we will go to Makeda Lul from the Security and Justice for Tigrayans Canada.
Thank you, MP Asasi, and thank you to all the speakers here today. On behalf of the Tigrayan community in Canada and across the world, words fail me to express the gratitude for you guys taking the initiative to holding the perpetrators accountable, and that there needs to be a standard set in the international system, and to continue to uphold that standard. As MP Asasi introduced me, my name is Makeda Lul. I'm the current chair of the Security and Justice for Tigrayans Canada, and I'm here to represent the sentiments and voices of Tigrayans in Tigray and in the Canadian diaspora. Today marks a significant day for Tigrayans worldwide. It is a day of renewed hope as we slowly yet surely inch closer towards justice for the deliberate suffering unleashed on the people of Tigray. Since November 2020, Tigrayans have been facing the deadliest war in the 21st century. These are not my words, but words quoted by many news outlets and notable diplomatic figures, and most recently in the newly published New Lines Institute report. Since the start of the war, Tigrayans worldwide unified as one voice for the people in Tigray who were physically, financially, and technologically cut off from the world, while they were viciously massacred, starved, and raped in the dark, and every facet of their way of being completely destroyed. The signing of the Pretoria Peace Agreement on November 2nd, 2022 brought a sense of relief as it put a stop to the guns and promised a path towards accountability, sustainability, and peace. However, nearly 2 years since the agreement was signed, and no tangible steps towards accountability or a return to normalcy has been made. Over 60,000 Tigrayan refugees are stuck in Sudan, escaping home from one war to find themselves caught in another one. They are so vulnerable and desperate that some are even taking the risk to go back to Tigray, where occupying forces are waiting. Just yesterday, the UN's Interagency Standing Committee released an evaluation of the response to the humanitarian crisis in Tigray and surrounding regions. We commend the humanitarian organizations who stayed through the war and delivered services to communities in dire need under challenging circumstances. However, the report found that the quality and appropriateness of the limited aid that reached the communities did not align with the actual scale of need. In Ethiopia, humanitarian data can only be published with the federal government's approval, and the government has admitted to wanting to starve Tigray. They were skewing the metrics and numbers. Hundreds of thousands of Tigrayans starved to death or died from lack of medicine. That suffering and death continues today. The interagency report yesterday found that serious mistakes made in responding to the needs of the people, quote, amount to a system failure. We call on Antonio Guterres to launch an internal review panel of UN actions in Ethiopia. There are still nearly 1 million IDPs without adequate living essentials, and over 120,000 victims of extreme gender-based violence who are left to tend to their physical and psychological wounds themselves, with virtually no functioning hospitals left after their deliberate destruction. Many sympathizers and loyalists of the Ethiopian and Eritrean governments claim that the lived realities of Tigrayans are made up and based on biased, unverifiable half-truths. Over the last 4 years, they have heavily invested time and resources into drowning out our voices and flooding social media and other outlets with misinformation and disinformation campaigns, doing everything they can to derail advocacy for the rights and dignity of Tigrayans. On top of the gaslighting and propaganda from Ethiopian and Eritrean government loyalists, Canada's geopolitical interests in the region have disappointingly taken precedence over the human rights abuses in Tigray. The light taps on the wrist for the human rights abuses committed in Tigray while resuming mining operations to extract gold and other valuable minerals in the region is intolerable. We urge the Canadian government to rethink its investments and to carefully inspect and verify best mining practices in the region, while also applying diplomatic pressure on the Ethiopian government to meet the Geneva Convention and international law standards. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank the New Lines Institute for not forgetting Tigray while the rest of the world moved on, and using all of its resources at its disposal to publish a credible legal analysis that affirms what Tigrayans have been saying since the beginning. This report provides us with a clear call to meet our legally binding obligation to prevent genocide and to hold all stakeholders accountable in ensuring the international system is not in jeopardy and states maintain the universal standards laid out in international law. I'd also like to thank the Montreal Institute for Genocide Studies and the University of Ottawa in taking part in this critical event and continuing to be a voice and ally for genocide victims worldwide. I'd also like to thank members of Parliament who have been advocating and continuing to raise their concerns in Parliament about the dire crisis in Tigray and Ethiopia as a whole. Thank you.
Okay, I think that's it for speakers. I'm seeing no questions online. I will ask one myself. I'm just wondering, I mean, obviously you're here for a reason. What would you like to see the Canadian government do in response to this report? And I'm not sure whoever feels best placed to answer that.
Well, I'll certainly begin. Part of the problem and the impetus for the report is that this has somehow in the context of all else that's happening in the world become kind of forgotten and unfortunately in some respects papered over. Unfortunately, the European Union, the United States of America, for example, have re-engaged with aid and assistance programs, trade and investment and so forth, essentially a return to normal or an effort to return to normal. I certainly appreciate that there are geopolitical interests and so forth that exist, but to essentially ignore what has happened, probably the largest single loss of life, certainly in the last decades in the world, and also even as a percentage of population, an astounding loss of life and harm. Our feeling is that this just cannot be ignored. It also portends very, very bad things for the rest of the world, including Canada's place. So Canada has a potential here, has the scope of some leadership to stand up, to raise the flag again, and to call it out, but also to do certain things. And it could what is within the realm, for example, its own relationships, its own diplomatic initiatives, its own trade and exchange, even notifying that an intention that it will exercise universal jurisdiction if any perpetrator should come within the Canadian jurisdiction and so forth. Those kind of pronouncements can be useful. But at the moment, it's kind of crickets out there.
And along those lines, you mentioned that Europe and the United States have sort of returned to normal. Is Canada sort of in that back to where it was before this war began?
I hesitate to respond to that. I mean, maybe Mr. Assassi knows better in terms of the Foreign Affairs Committee, but I think there's a risk of that. I mean, we tend to follow our allies. We tend to follow certainly those very close, such as south of the border and so forth. So at the moment, it's more the silence that is deafening.
Okay, thank you for that. Seeing no questions online, I will end this press conference. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.